Scald is one of the most controversial moves in the history of competitive singles. This move was introduced in Generation 5, and it is one of the few moves powerful enough to change the entire landscape of competitive singles. Scald seems innocent enough, an 80 base power water-type special attack with a 30% chance to inflict burn. But don't be fooled. This combination of a decent water-type attack with solid power, and a crippling secondary effect with a pretty high chance to occur, are extremely powerful. Players very quickly discovered just how good Scald was. Scald could not only be used as an offensive water-type attack with the powerful upside of burning your opponent, it could be used on defensive Pokemon too. Defensive Pokemon have many opportunities to throw out Scald until it eventually burns. In Gens 3 and 4, defensive water types would often run Surf or Hydro Pump, just as a way to deal a bit of damage and play around Taunt. Combining an attack with a status effect is extremely strong on a defensive Pokemon. All of a sudden, switching into a water resist against this water type attack is not safe, because there's a 30% chance that your Pokemon will be permanently crippled. Burn is a very high impact status effect that can turn a Pokemon like Gyarados from a powerful game-ending threat into a completely useless team slot that will deal no damage and slowly wither away. Even if you burn a special attacker or a defensive Pokemon that doesn't use their physical attack stat, it's still significant. Burn deals a massive 1/8 of a Pokemon's max HP in damage per turn, which completely guts their longevity and can be enough to wear them down with the chip damage. Scald is just an incredibly safe move to click with nothing but upside. There are very few things in the game that can safely come in against Scald. Scald spam became a central concept in Gen 5 OU, and the metagame began to adapt around it. Breloom is a Pokemon with access to Poison Heal, so with a Toxic Orb to inflict self-poison, enabling this ability, this is one of the few physical attackers that can resist Scald and be safe from the burn effect. Reuniclus is a bulky magic guard user that is completely immune to all residual damage including burn, and is a popular choice in Gen 5. Some Pokemon even started using Rawstberry specifically to heal themselves from a Scald burn. Most of the time you would think Lumberry is a better option since it can cure any status, but Scald is so strong and dominant that sometimes getting paralyzed is actually advantageous because it means you can't get burned anymore. A paralyzed Ferrothorn, for example, is totally safe from Scald burns, so Rawstberry ensures that you can only cure burn, not any other status, so that if you get paralyzed, you keep it for that valuable burn immunity. The fact that Scald has such an impact on this metagame is quite problematic. It restricts options and makes normal plays that used to be safe, like switching a water resistance in on a water type attack, now potentially game losing. This kind of flipped singles on its head, and the dominance of Scald spam created some frustrating gameplay interactions. Other moves with powerful secondary effects such as Lava Plume or Body Slam do at least have immunities that you can switch into to reasonably prevent them. Fire types are immune to burn, so they can safely come in against Lava Plume, resisting the move with no risk at all of being burned. But the fact that Scald is a water type attack means fire types can't safely switch in against it because it's super effective, restricting that form of counterplay. Of course, every single Pokemon metagame centers around powerful strategies and concepts. This is just what happens in competitive games of every kind. Gen 3 centers around Sandstorm and Spikes, so sand and spike immune Pokemon often have high usage and have risen to the forefront of that metagame. Stealth Rock was also a move that completely changed singles in a similar way, to the point of dictating what was viable and what wasn't. Pokemon weak to rock had to seriously make up for it in other areas to be able to compete in OU now that Stealth Rock existed, an extremely high value one-turn move that totally crippled many Pokemon to the point of irrelevance. Scald is similar in its metagame impact. Pokemon that are able to switch in against Scald rose in popularity when it was introduced, and Pokemon vulnerable to Scald fell. But what makes Scald particularly hated in the community compared to these other central and powerful competitive concepts is the randomness of its powerful effect and the kind of gameplay interactions it creates. Rain mirrors in Gen 5 OU will often come down to two Pokemon fishing for Scald burns against each other, and whoever lands the burn first gets a huge advantage. Although there are tools to manage Scald, sometimes there are just situations where you have no choice but to switch in against a Scald and hope for the best, and there's a 30% chance that you'll just lose on the spot, which is quite frustrating. The prevalence of Scald also skews the metagame towards the few Pokemon that can handle it, and severely restricts the Pokemon that can't. After Gen 5, a lot was done to try and minimize the frustrations of Scald. In Gen 7, Burn was nerfed to now only deal 1/16 of a Pokemon's HP per turn, rather than 1/8, so Scald burns weren't quite as crippling against non-physical attackers. In Gen 7, the Pokemon Tapu Fini helped out against Scald spam with its Misty Surge ability. This ability creates misty terrain on the field, which grants all grounded Pokemon a complete status immunity. This makes Tapu Fini itself a great switch-in against Scald, and it also serves to shield your teammates from the burn effect. While Scald did become more manageable with these developments, it still created those frustrating and game-deciding situations here and there. It's just a very frustrating move that I believe is poorly designed. It promotes gameplay that is safe, uninteresting, and high variance. Which is why when Gen 9 first released, the singles community rejoiced at the fact that Scald was nowhere to be seen. It seemed like Game Freak had actually listened for once and removed this controversial and universally hated move. With the release of Pokemon Home compatibility, only a single Pokemon was able to use Scald again, Volcanion, a Pokemon that already has the signature move Steam Eruption, a move with the same 30% burn chance but higher base power. Restricting the move to only a single Pokemon, who has a better option anyway, is great. A far cry from previous generations where almost every bulky water type seemed to have access to the move and would spam it safely to their heart's content. But that changed with the recent release of Gen 9's new DLC, where Scald, unfortunately, came back as a TM. Many of us were worried that this restriction on Scald was not an intentional design choice aimed at improving the singles experience. It looked as if they just hadn't gotten around to adding the move yet, instead gating it behind the new DLC. I, like many others, was quite disappointed upon hearing about this, but there is a silver lining. While Scald is back, in Gen 9, the move actually feels more manageable than ever. Scald's distribution is a lot more scarce in Gen 9. Pokemon like Toxapex and Gastrodon that once used the move frequently to fish for burns no longer have access to it. The amount of OU ranked Pokemon with access to Scald is pretty limited actually. The most relevant example of a Scald user that can be used in the OU metagame would be Alabamola, a solid defensive water type with Regenerator. There's also Walking Wake, who is really more of an offensively oriented Pokemon anyway, and would prefer to use its signature move Hydro Steam on most sets. Slowking now has access to the move as well, another bulky water type with Regenerator, who has seen a decent amount of use in OU, but is not nearly as central as Pokemon like Toxapex or Politoed, who were once OU staples. Powerful moves like Scald can feel more reasonable when you are more careful about who you hand them out to. Spore, for example, is one of the best moves in the entire game, but it has never felt like a huge problem, because very few Pokemon actually have access to it, and the Pokemon that do are limited in other areas. It seems like they're doing something similar with Scald here. Who knows if this is intentional or not, it's hard to tell sometimes. But this scarcity in the distribution of Scald is a welcome change. Not only is Scald far rarer than it once was, a new form of universal counterplay to the move has been introduced in Gen 9. Covert Cloak is a great new item that has already seen a good amount of use in OU before the return of Scald. This item grants the holder a complete immunity to the secondary effects from moves. What's nice about this item is that it doesn't just protect you from Scald, it protects you from effects like Garganical Salt Cure, Body Slam Paralysis, and the many 10% secondary effects from moves like Ice Beam and Thunderbolt that can often decide games. So using Covert Cloak on a Pokemon can shield you from much more than just Scald. This is a much more alluring option than something like Rawstberry back in Gen 5, which almost felt desperate. This is my favorite new item design in quite a while, that gives the player a very welcome form of counterplay against a lot of common and annoying moves, including Scald. Terra Water, Garganical, and Gliscor are also completely immune to Scald's burn effects and can take advantage of Scald spamming Pokemon with high value moves of their own. I have many issues with competitive singles in Gen 9, but this is something that I think they've actually done quite well. The limited distribution and new forms of counterplay to Scald have made this once oppressive and frustrating move feel a lot more reasonable. This is a rare moment where Gen 9 has done something right. But an even better solution to this Scald problem is to play a metagame where Scald doesn't exist at all, and neither does Stealth Rock. Gen Gen 3 OU, my favorite metagame. Me and co-host Simeon are currently hosting a huge Gen 3 OU tournament with a prize pool that has almost reached $3,000. And every single day on my second channel, there are commentated sets to watch from the tournament. If you want to see a metagame where people can make Pikachu and Butterfree of all things work on a competitive team somehow, check out these sets. Thank you to the patrons for your continued support, and thank you to everyone who has donated to the tournament's prize pool.
KO by one hit! It scattered light!
The money got different.